Some burst or spurt redeemed him when he seemed flagging short of the goal, and whoever else was in the running, he came in ahead. His near failures were the error of a rare trust to the spontaneity in which other speakers confide, or are believed to confide, when they are on their feet. He knew that from the beginning of oratory, the orator's spontaneity was for the silence and solitude of his closet, where he used his words to an imagined audience. That this was the use of orators from Demosthenes and Cicero up and down. He studied every word and syllable, and memorized them by a system of mnemonics peculiar to himself, consisting of an arbitrary arrangement of things on a table: knives, borders, salt cellars, ink stains, pens, boxes, or whatever was at hand, which stood for points and clauses and climaxes, and were at once indelible diction and constant suggestion. He studied every tone and every gesture, and he forecast the result with the real audience from its result with that imagined audience. Therefore, it was beautiful to see him and to hear him. He rejoiced in the pleasure he gave and the blows of surprise which he dealt. And because he had his end in mind, he knew when to stop. I have been talking of his method and manner. The matter the reader has here before him, and it is good matter, glad, honest, kind, just. W. D. Howells. End of section 000. Introduction to Mark Twain Speeches, read by John Greenwood. This is section 001 of Mark Twain Speeches. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Mark Twain Speeches by Mark Twain. Preface. From the preface to the English edition of Mark Twain's Sketches. If I were to sell the reader a barrel of molasses, and he, instead of sweetening his substantial dinner with the saying at judicious intervals, should eat the entire barrel at one sitting, and then accuse me for making him sick, I would say that he deserved to be made sick for not knowing any better how to utilize the blessings this world affords. And if I sell to the reader this volume of nonsense, and he, instead of seasoning his graver reading with a chapter of it now and then, when his mind demands such relaxation, unwisely overdoses himself with several chapters of it at a single sitting, he will deserve to be nauseated, and he will have nobody to blame but himself if he is. There is no more sin in publishing an entire volume of nonsense than there is in keeping a candy store with no hardware in it. It lies wholly with the customer whether he will injure himself by means of either, or will derive from them the benefits which they will afford him if he uses their possibilities judiciously. Respectfully submitted, the author. End of the preface. Mark Twain Speeches. This is section 002 of Mark Twain Speeches. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Story of a Speech by Mark Twain, read by John Greenwood. An address delivered in 1877, and a review of it 29 years later. The original speech was delivered at a dinner given by the publishers of the Atlantic Monthly in honor of the 70th anniversary of the birth of John Greenleaf Whittier at the Hotel Brunswick, Boston, December 17, 1877. This is an occasion peculiarly meet for the digging up of pleasant reminiscences concerning literary folk. Therefore I will drop lightly into history myself. Standing here on the shore of the Atlantic and contemplating certain of its largest literary billows, I am reminded of a thing which happened to me 13 years ago, when I had just succeeded in stirring up a little Nevadian literary puddle myself. whose spewing flakes were beginning to blow thinly California wide. I started an inspection track through the southern mines of California. I was callow and conceited, and I resolved to try the virtue of my nom de guerre. I very soon had an opportunity. I knocked at a miner's lonely log cabin in the foothills of the Sierras just at nightfall. It was snowing at the time. A jaded, melancholy man of 50, barefooted, opened the door to me. When he heard my nom de guerre, he looked more dejected than before. He let me in, pretty reluctantly, I thought, and after the customary bacon and beans, black coffee and hot whiskey, I took a pipe. This sorrowful man had not said 3 words up to this time. Now he spoke up and said, in the voice of one who is secretly suffering, "You're the fourth. I'm going to move." "The fourth what?" said I. "The fourth literary man who has been here in 24 hours. I'm going to move." "You don't tell me," said I. "Who were the others?" "Mr. Longfellow, Mr. Emerson, and Mr. Oliver Wendell Holmes consound a lot." You can easily believe I was interested. I supplicated. 3 hot whiskeys did the rest, and finally the melancholy miner began. Said he, "They came here just at dark yesterday evening, and I let them in, of course. Said they were going to the Yosemite. They were a rough lot, but that's nothing. Everybody looks rough that travels to work. Mr. Emerson was a seedy little bit of a chap, red-headed. Mr. Holmes was as fat as a balloon. He weighed as much as 300 and had double chins all the way down to his stomach. Mr. Longfellow was built like a prize fighter. His head was cropped and bristly, like as if he had a wig made of hairbrushes. His nose lay straight down his face, like a finger with the end joint tilted up. They'd been drinking, I could see that. And what queer talk they used. Mr. Holmes inspected his cabin, then he took me by the buttonhole and says he, "Through the deep caves of thought I hear a voice that sings, 'Build thee more stately mansions, O my soul.'" Says I can't afford it, Mr. Holmes. Moreover, I don't want to. Blamed if I liked it pretty well either, coming from a stranger that way. However, I started to get out my bacon and beans. When Mr. Emerson came and looked on a while, and then he takes me aside by the buttonhole and says, "Give me agates for my meat. Give me cantharids to eat. From air and ocean bring me foods from all zones and altitudes." Says I, "Mr. Emerson, if you'll excuse me, this ain't no hotel." You see, it sort of riled me. I weren't used to the ways of literary swells. But I went on a-sweating over my work, and next comes Mr. Longfellow and buttonholes me and interrupts me. Says he, "Honor be to Mudge Kiewis. You shall hear how Paw Puck Kiewis," but I broke in. And says I, "Beg your pardon, Mr. Longfellow, if you'll be so kind as to hold your yacht for about 5 minutes and let me get this club ready, you'll do me proud." Well, sir, after they filled up, I set out the jug. Mr. Holmes looks at it, and then he fires up all of a sudden and yells, "Flash out a stream of blood-red wine, or I would drink 2 other days." By George, I was getting kind of worked up. I don't deny it, I was getting kind of worked up. I turns to Mr. Holmes and says I, "Looky here, my fat friend, I'm a-running this shanty, and if the court knows herself, you'll take whiskey straight or you'll go dry." Them's the very words I said to him. Now, I don't want to sass such famous literary people, but you see, they kind of forced me. There ain't nothing unreasonable about me. I don't mind a passel of guests treading on my tail 3 or 4 times, but when it comes to standing on it, it's different. If the court knows herself, I says, you'll take whiskey straight or you'll go dry. Well, between drinks, they'd swell around the cabin and strike attitudes and spout, and pretty soon they got out at the greasy old deck and went to playing euchre at 10 cents a corner on trust. I began to notice some pretty suspicious things. Mr. Emerson dealt, looked at his hand, shook his head, says, "I am the doubter and the doubt," and calmly bunched the hands and went to shuffling for a new layout. Says he, "They reckon ill who leave me out. They know not well the subtle ways I keep. I pass and deal again." How did he didn't go ahead and do it, too? Oh, he was a cool one. Well, in about a minute, things were running pretty tight. But all of a sudden, I see by Mr. Emerson's eye, he judged he had him. He had already corralled 2 tricks, and each of the others won. So now he kind of lifts a little in his chair and says, "I tire of globes and aces. Too long the game is played." And down he fetched the right bower, and Mr. Longfellow smiles as sweet as pie and says, Thanks to thee, my worthy friend, for the lesson thou hast taught." And blamed that he didn't down with another right bower. Emerson claps his hand on his bow. Longfellow claps his on his revolver, and I went under the bunk. There was going to be trouble, but that monstrous Holmes rose up, wobbling his double chins, and says he, "Order, gentlemen! The first man that draws, I'll lay down on him and smother him." All quiet on the Potomac, you bet. They were free. How come you so? By now. And they begun to blow. Emerson says, "The knobbiest thing I ever wrote was Barbara Fritchie." Says Longfellow, "They don't begin with my Bigelow papers." Says Holmes, "My Thanatopsis lays over them both." They mighty near ended in a fight. Then they wished they'd some more company. And Mr. Emerson pointed to me and says, "Is yonder squalid peasant all that this proud nursery could breed?" He was a-wetting his bow on his boot, so I let it pass. Well, sir, next, they took it into their heads that they would like some music. So they made me stand up and sing "When Johnny Comes Marching Home," till I dropped at 13 minutes past 4 this morning. That's what I've been through, my friend. When I woke at 7, they were leaving, thank goodness.
Oh,
and
no.
Mr. Longfellow had my only boots on, and his under his arm. Says I, "Hold on there, Evangeline. What are you going to do with them?" He says, "Going to make tracks with them, because lives of great men all remind us we can make our lives sublime, and departing leave behind us footprints on the sands of time." As I said, Mr. Twain, you are the 4th in 24 hours, and I'm going to move. I ain't suited to a literary atmosphere. I said to the miner, "Why, my dear sir, these were not the gracious singers to whom we and the world pay loving reverence and homage. These were impostors." The miner investigated me with a calm eye for a while, and said, "Ah, impostors, were they? Are you?" And I did not pursue the subject, and since then I have not traveled on my nom de guerre enough to hurt. Such was the reminiscence I was moved to contribute, Mr. Chairman. In my enthusiasm, I may have exaggerated the details a little, but you will easily forgive me that fault, since I believe it is the first time I have ever deflected from perpendicular fact on the occasion like this. From Mark Twain's autobiography, January 11, 1906. Answer to a letter received this morning. Dear Mrs. Phillips, I am forever your debtor for reminding me of that curious passage in my life. During the first year or 2 after it happened, I could not bear to think of it. My pain and shame were so intense, and my sense of having been an imbecile so settled, established, and confirmed, that I drove the episode entirely from my mind. And so, all these 28 or 29 years, I have lived in the conviction that my performance at that time was coarse, vulgar, and destitute of humor. But your suggestion that you and your family found humor in it 28 years ago moved me to look into the matter. So I commissioned a Boston typewriter to delve among the Boston papers of that bygone time and send me a copy of it. It came this morning, and if there is any vulgarity about it, I am not able to discover it. If it isn't innocently and ridiculously funny, I am no judge. I will see to it that you get a copy. What I have said to Mrs. H. is true. I did suffer during a year or two from the deep humiliations of that episode, but at last in 1888 in Venice, my wife and I came across Mr. and Mrs. A.P.C. of Concord, Massachusetts, and a friendship began then of the sort which nothing but death terminates. The C's were very bright people and in every way charming and companionable. We were together a month or two in Venice, and several months in Rome afterward, and one day that lamented break of mine was mentioned, and when I was on the point of lathering those people for bringing it to my mind when I had gotten memory of it almost squelched, I perceived with joy that the C's were indignant about the way that my performance had been received in Boston. They poured out their opinions most freely and frankly about the frosty attitude of the people who were present at that performance, and about the Boston newspapers for the position they had taken in regard to the matter. That position was that I had been irreverent beyond belief, beyond imagination. Very well, I had accepted that as a fact for a year or two, and had been fairly miserable about it whenever I thought of it, which was not frequently, if I could help it. Whenever I thought of it, I wondered how I ever could have been inspired to do so unholy a thing. Well, the C's comforted me, but they did not persuade me to continue to think about the unhappy episode. I resisted that. I tried to get it out of my mind and let it die, and I succeeded. Until Mrs. H's letter came. It had been a good 25 years since I had thought of that matter. And when she said that the thing was funny, I wondered if possibly she might be right. At any rate, my curiosity was aroused, and I wrote to Boston and got the whole thing copied as above set forth. I vaguely remember some of the details of that gathering. Dimly I can see 100 people. No, perhaps 50. Shadowy figures sitting at tables, eating, ghosts now came, and nameless forevermore. I don't know who they were, but I can very distinctly see, seated at the grand table and facing the rest of us,